The White Pill is available now at whitepillbook.com. This episode is brought to you by Patriot Gold. Good afternoon, Michael Malice here. Let that be your welcome for the next hour. You guys are really in for a treat. We have returning guest, one of my favorite people, Carol Roth. Her new book is out now. It's called You Will Own Nothing. And it's a reference to that famous, notorious ad from the World Economic Forum claiming that you will own nothing and you will be happy. Now, Carol, I was reading about the book and I was really excited because in the circles you and I travel in, and this is, by the way, if you pick up her previous book, The War on Small Business, we did an episode on that. I read that book. I enjoyed it immensely. And the thing I like about Carol is, unlike so many people in this space, you actually do your homework and you bring the receipts. So instead of just fear mongering like the sky's falling, which sometimes it might be, you're like, all right, here's the data. Here's where this is all coming from. I'm curious as to, we were just talking briefly before we got started, and you were talking about how this takes the conspiracy out of the whole conspiracy theory aspect about this, because you see a lot of World Economic Forum. In many cases, they're this right of center boogeyman in the same way that Trump is a left of center boogeyman, and everything bad is a function of Trump, and they're coming for this and coming for that. Now, if I was a leftist, it's not entirely untrue. I mean, what I've been encouraging people to do is to reply to literally anything on social media with, I support Trump because he ended abortion and racism, and I guarantee the reactions are going to be apoplectic and hilarious. But in all seriousness, if I was a leftist, Trump did end Roe v. Wade. That's not a minor setback for my cause. So can you talk a bit about how this book got conceived and just how much of this is fear-mongering from Conservative Inc. and how much of this really is them showing their hand, the World Economic Forum?
Yeah, so probably like you, Michael, although I'm not nearly as funny on social media as you are about it. You see these things pop up. A lot of times they come from people who are nuttier than a jar of peanut butter. And you go, I don't know. That's probably not what was said. It was probably taken out of context. There's got to be more here. So when you hear about the World Economic Forum, which is basically a group that's littered with the business and political elite, and you hear that they're predicting the end of private property, you're like, there's probably a missing piece to the story, right? And so you go and you source the video, which is on the World Economic Forum's Twitter site right now, at least as we're recording this. And they have the top 8 predictions for 2030 for the world. It's from their Global Futures Council. So there's some council that weighed in on this. And the number one is you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. Oh, by the way, number 2 is the US will no longer be the world's leading superpower. But nobody ever made it to number 2, I guess, or some of the other ones in there. But when I hear you'll own nothing and you'll be happy, as somebody who's an advocate for wealth creation for people, and I've been doing this for over a quarter of a century, I'm a recovering investment banker, these are things that are sort of center of the plate. I'm like, well, why would the world's elite be saying that like you wouldn't have wealth creation opportunities? Because I know that wealth comes from ownership. You have to own assets that have the opportunity to retain or increase in value. That's sort of the differential between having income and money and having wealth. That's the differential. So that sounded really strange to me. So after I did the very small amount of research to find that, I started doing more research. And I found that this was an idea that had been repackaged and repurposed. There was this sort of fantastical article that came out before then. There was another one that said, can I rent everything in my life and be happy? And it actually traces all the way back to 1971 when Klaus Schwab, who is either like the best prototype of a Bond villain, if you've ever seen him. He just looks like he's straight out of Central Casting, but he's also the CEO of the World Economic Forum. When he started this as the European Management Forum in 1971, his very first idea was around this idea of stakeholders. And a stakeholder is sort of a weasel word because we don't know what that means or where it comes from, but it stands apart from being a shareholder. being a shareholder is ownership, and you have earned that
Yeah.
ownership either through your time, your blood, your sweat, your tears, or through investing your capital and taking on risk. And so since 1971, he's a persistent MFer, right? He's been trying to get this idea of stakeholders, within, ingrained into sort of the culture. And as I started thinking about all the things that were going on, social credit, ESG, Wall Street competing with you to own a house, big tech renting your life back to you as a subscription or a service, CBDC's debasement of the currency, whatever it was, like I kept going, there's got to be a through line here. And I'm just walking one day, it hits me like a lightning bolt. You will own nothing.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about what is the World Economic Forum? Like I hear everyone talk about it as this, and it's a very Orwellian name. When you hear something that's like for Society for the Promotion of Happiness, you know that they're going to be advocating for euthanasia and like eugenics. That's just how these organizations work. So what literally is the World Economic Forum?
Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, and then I'm going to tell you a story from the book that kind of
Yes.
ties into that. So, the World Economic Forum is a non governmental organization, or at least so they say, that is based in Switzerland. It was started by Klaus Schwab, this guy who's like an engineer and a purveyor of ideas. Back in 1971, as I said, as sort of the European Management Forum. And over time, as sort of geopolitics shifted, and there were a number of big things that happened in the 70s, he somehow attracted political people to start coming, and it started broadening out, and it basically became this sort of organization that was noted in particular for its gatherings in Davos, Switzerland, which is a very
Okay.
ritzy area. You probably hear about that, once or twice a year, people gathering in Davos. And, again, to take the conspiracy out of this, most of the people who are associated with this do it because it's a great place to go meet their friends and
Yeah,
fly their private
networking.
jet and go to
Yeah.
Davos and have steak and caviar and whatnot. But what ends up happening is, whether it's willingly because there's sort of a profiteering reason or because they're just useful idiots, they end up taking these ideas and carrying them back to the mainstream. So a lot of these thoughts that kind of get brought up from the World Economic Forum somehow end up leaking in. There's a great video. Well, it's not so great for everyone, but it's great to be able to kind of check the boxes and cross the T's and dot the I's. When Klaus Schwab was talking to the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and he was talking about one of their programs, which is this Young Global Leaders, and they try to get really high profile people in and associate them with the World Economic Forum to give them more heft and credibility. And he was talking about how he was going around some political event, and he saw Angela Merkel, the former chancellor of Germany, and he saw Justin Trudeau, from Canada, and Chrystia Freeland, who's the vice chair of Canada under Trudeau, and she's also the finance minister. And he's saying, all these people, young global leaders, and he's talking about it, and he's like, and so, we penetrate the cabinets. And you're kind of like, when somebody says we penetrate the cabinets, like that's a pretty specific phrase. And I kind of feel like it sounds like what it sounds like. So I think that, working with lots of top tier consulting firms and accounting firms and whatnot, they create all these ideas, which, are very profitable for them, because now they get to consult and advise on this new
Yeah.
thing, whether it's ESG or whatever it is. And a lot of the people who are involved don't sort of see the bad side of it. But, a lot of the ideas are questionable. And here's where it sort of ties into where you come from. So there's a great vintage Twilight Zone episode. And Michael, you seem like somebody who might be into vintage Twilight Zone. So
Do
you
you mean
may.
because I look like? Do you mean because I look like a pig?
Yes, that's exactly why we took out the bandages, and that's that's what you look like. So, but so there's one where these aliens come down to Earth,
Oh yeah.
and
Okay, I'm not gonna.
okay,
Yeah.
yeah, I'll let you do the final line. So the aliens come down, to Earth, and they arrive, and the people of Earth are like, why are the aliens here? And they say, listen, people of Earth, you guys have famines, you have wars. We have this technology on our planet that's eliminated all of this. We feel really sorry for you. We're just smarter and have better technology. So we're just here to help you. And the people of Earth at first are skeptical, and they're like, why would somebody want to help us? That doesn't make sense. So they put the alien through a lie detector test. And while he's taking the lie detector test, they also notice that he leaves, like, some sort of a book behind. And they go and they think maybe it's like a manual. And some CIA type of group starts to decode it. And they see that the title is To Serve Man. And so he passes the lie detector test. The book says they're there to serve man, so everything seems kosher. So the people of Earth, kind of go along, and they're being friends with the aliens, and they start making trips up to the aliens' planet because, hey, they want to see this utopia. And one of the CIA guys decides he's going to go now, and he's walking up the spaceship, the little entry
Ram.
to the spaceship.
Yeah.
And the person from the CIA was cracking the code has now cracked the code to the rest of the book, and she runs out and she says,
It's a cookbook.
"It's a cookbook. To serve man is a cookbook." And I just feel like that's the takeaway here from all of these people who are supposed to be better and know better from us. And, we're doing this for the good of people. Like, to serve man is a cookbook.
Well, there's a couple of points there. First of all, I think it's just hilarious that there'd be a cookbook when you for a species you've never encountered before. Like, you know what I mean? Like, can you imagine us trying to write a cookbook about aliens not knowing what their biology is like? Also, to your point, and maybe this is our tinfoil hat, I'm 99% sure that the head alien was the guy who played Jaws, the James Bond villain. So there's another little
I
connection
know
there to
it's
what
the
you're.
guy who played Lurch on,
Yes,
yeah, so if he's the
on
same guy,
Adam's
then
Family.
yes,
That
yes,
yeah.
yes.
And it's also hilarious that aliens are, instead of bringing like an iPod or iPad with them, they're gonna have a physical book. Like, if I'm going to space, like, instead of having this, which you could have literally the entire library, I'm just gonna have a physical copy of a book. Anyway, to your point,
Well, because they wanted to own things, Michael. They knew you
yeah.
needed to have physical ownership. The aliens
But
were smart even back then.
let's just break down this, because you were saying that this is kind of taking the conspiracy theory out of this whole WEF. This word conspiracy is something that I talk about a lot, and it's just fascinating because there is an acknowledgement across the political spectrum that multinational elites will collaborate with one another to further their interests against the interests of the general population. That is a completely uncontroversial statement. But if you apply that to any specific instance of the tribe that person you're talking to belongs to, they'll hand wave it away as a conspiracy theory. So conspiracy theories always happen over there with the bad guys, but we're the good guys, and we don't have that. But also, this word conspiracy is just completely incoherent, because let's look at just McDonald's, right? If I go to a McDonald's in California or in Florida or in Toronto, or in India, India, they're not going to have beef, but they're going to be the same recognizable menu. Now, it's this multinational organization, and it's going to have different languages, but it's going to be the same, or recognizable at least wherever you go. Is that a conspiracy? It's not. It's just organization across space and time. So the claim that somehow there aren't these multinational organizations that organize across different countries to further interests, like, what's the difference between that and a conspiracy? That you don't approve it, that you do approve it?
I
What
mean,
you're pointing out.
what's the G7, right? Like, isn't
Yeah,
that a group that's meant to coordinate together? I mean, isn't that the whole purpose of it?
yeah, and they're not doing this secretly, as you point out. This is all, the receipts are on paper. But what just clicked when you were describing how they operate is that another way of looking at it would be like globalism university, because how the universities work in the States, as I'm sure you'll agree, is you have these young, highly intelligent, ambitious kids. They go to school, they're trained in the progressive ideology, and then 4 years later they leave university as, like, instead of a nubile young co-ed, as an unrecognizable swamp walrus. But then they're all seeding this worldview in all the different organizations, both governmental and private and NGO, or nonprofit, that they happen to work in. And it's not a conspiracy, but they're spreading this worldview because they've been trained accordingly. And it seems very clear that what's happening in Davos is, I'm in Trudeau's cabinet, I have a huge portfolio. Some of these issues I'm not going to have any awareness of because
Yeah.
it's not my background, or they're just simply too much on my plate. How is it possible? Well, here's Klaus Schwab. He gives me a dossier, And I know I'll have my talking points, I'll have the criticisms, I'll have my answers. My homework is done for me. So there doesn't even have to be something nefarious on the cabinet members' end, so much as that they're a human being who has finite resources. And very conveniently, Uncle Klaus is going to tell me what to think and spread. And look, all the other elites are there smiling and nodding their head. So I'm not sticking my neck out. I'm not going to have a problem with this. Kind of how corporate America works. Like, I don't want to be, when Black Lives Matter is coming down, to be CrossFit and be like, look, we're a homosexual exercise company. We don't have anything to do with Black Lives Matter. And the CEO's fired because he didn't have the Instagram square be a black square for that day. So
Right.
it sounds, there's a lot of conservatives who make it sound like shadowy and nefarious, but it's in sunny Switzerland and in the open.
Well, and not only that, so, the way that I've sort of framed this, that, talk about that we're going through World War F, which is a financial world war where you are
Yeah,
effed. And basically, the WF is just a small part of it. They gave me the really nice, kind of cover title, for the book, but they're not the only one that we're talking about here. We're talking about your government related entities, whether it's, Congress or the Federal Reserve. We're talking about the WEF, but we're also talking about the UN, and we're talking about
yeah,
big business, and we're talking about big tech. And so sometimes these people do, maybe it's a conspiracy or they coordinate together, but sometimes they just work solo, but they have a lot of the same objectives. And it comes down to another conspiracy theory that I would like to share, which is not a conspiracy theory, which is the New World Order, which is something that I think you're sort of alluding to in terms of the people coordinating together. So, New World Order, or I call it New Financial World Order because I view things from the financial lens, really is a function of historical cycles. I mean, we are 80 years into the US being at the pole position, the center of the global financial universe, and we're starting to get a little long in the tooth. We've made all of these really bad decisions at the Fed and government level. They haven't held the dollar stable either here domestically or for the world, where they're supposed to do that as the reserve currency. Biden weaponized the dollar in terms of sanctions against Russia with the invasion of Ukraine by saying he couldn't have access to their reserves anymore. So, kind of hard to be the world's reserve currency when you can just kind of freeze them at your whim. And, before us, it was the British who had a very similar cycle. Before the
yeah.
British, it was the Dutch who had a very similar cycle. So, these things happen all the time. And I'm not the only person who knows this, the global elite know this. And so if you go on the White House's website and you look for Joe Biden's speech to the Business Roundtable on March 21st, 2022, or if you just Google Joe Biden New World Order, you'll find one of many speeches that he's given, but this in particular is one to the Business Roundtable, where he says, there's going to be a global shift in the world order. It happens every 3 or 4 generations, and he, says pretty much a quote: "There's going to be a new world order out there, and we've got to lead it." And since he's talking to the Business Roundtable, he's talking to the elite of the business elite, the CEOs of the publicly traded companies and whatnot. So I'm assuming he means them and not you and me, Michael. But maybe we'll be invited. I highly doubt it. So when you see that happening, you see that there's a shift in the global financial universe, and you're somebody who is powerful and well connected, that panics you because the status quo is good for you and changes
Yeah.
are bad. That threatens your wealth and your power. So what are you going to do? Are you going to sit back and go, well, I just hope everything in this new world order works out for me? Or are you going to go, okay, things are changing, we got to do things to make sure that we retain this wealth and power? And I think it's, again, doesn't take a large intellectual leap to go, of course they're going to do that. And in doing that, it's not that they're like trying to squelch your freedom or take, your ownership. It's not like that's the starting point. It's, we're doing this to protect ourselves. And if these things have to go by the wayside, so be it. Oh, and by the way, if we can get them to buy into it, if they think it's for their own good, if they think we are serving man, right? And that it's so good for you to not own a home, which is the largest driver of wealth for households and, across households in the United States and for most places in the world. If they buy in and think it's like super convenient to rent, like that's great. It'll make life so much easier for us.
Hey folks, Michael Malice here. I want to talk to you about an organization that is really doing good work and punching above their weight. and I wholly endorse and support, and that's the Pacific Legal Foundation. And they did not pay me to say that. That's free of charge because I mean it. In any given year, only 80 cases out of 8,000 are allowed to be heard by the Supreme Court, which is a huge long shot for law firms, both big and small. You have better odds of getting to Harvard or successfully robbing a bank. But with 17 Supreme Court victories under their belt, one public interest law firm is defying those odds, and that's the Pacific Legal Foundation. Last term, they had 3 cases make it before the court. Reuters called it a Supreme Court trifecta, and they won every one of them. Pacific Legal Foundation isn't afraid to take on the impossible. For 50 years, they fought relentlessly to help individuals all over the country fight back when the government violates their constitutional rights, and they've represented them free of charge. Their mission is simple: fighting for individual liberty in the courts. They sue the government and they win, and they have a track record to prove it. They represent all their clients free of charge. Whether it's property rights, equal protection of the law, or restoring the separation of powers, Pacific Legal Foundation is here to protect and defend your constitutional rights. Learn more about them at pacificlegal.org. And you know what? Now that I finished recording this, as soon as I get off the air, I'm going to send them some money. Let's get back to the show. Yeah, this is something that I kind of have to beat conservatives over the head very frequently. That it is always not, I don't want to say always, but it is almost always more preferable to win via persuasion than via
Yeah.
force. First of all, it's just sustainable long term, right? If I bring you around, Carol, to my way of thinking, I don't have to have a cop looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life to be like, all right, let's make sure she stays in line. Like, I can just take those resources that would pay for that cop's salary and put them elsewhere. Whereas if you look at even like an extreme example, like Vichy France with the resistance, it's like,
Right.
it's not easy, even if you conquer a country and and have totalitarianism, to be like, all right, now this is Nazi France, everything's going to be fine. You have a huge percentage of the population who are going to do whatever they can just do sabotage, even if they don't
Right.
have a kind of a long-term goal. It's just, we don't like it, we're just going to screw things up. Whereas if you sit them down and be like, hey, we're your noblesse oblige, we're the aristocracy, we're the good guys, I don't have to do any more work because you're the good guys. So much of American, especially, well, not to say especially, but so much of American media is based on this persuasive propaganda and having people buy in. It's so much closer to Brave New World and persuading through pleasure and short-term things than it is to 1984, where yes, you have the Patriot Act and they are spying on us, but they, instead of trying to break you, they'd much rather, give you some Twizzlers and, the Big Bang
Right.
Theory, and then you smile and nod and you punch your time clock and you do what you're told, and everyone wins from their perspective.
Yeah, it's funny that Huxley, Brave New Worlds, and 1984 all make appearances in the book, and it is funny because it's like it wasn't supposed to be a playbook, right? It was
Yeah.
supposed to be a warning, but in so many places there are these kind of weird parallels. And I agree, getting people to buy in, whether it's when they have this like Hollywoodification of a crisis, as I call it
Yes.
in the book. I describe this like Mad Men experience where John Hamm is like, what can we do to get everyone in on this, this big new marketing campaign? And we got to have high stakes and we got to have everyone involved and the world has to be at risk. We'll do climate change. And so you have to have the people who derive what I call ROE, return on ego, and they get to put the emoji in their bio and they get to put the
Yeah.
sign on the front lawn and wear the t-shirt and like, oh, look at how great we are. And, maybe you get to visit the White House as an influencer every once in a while or whatever it is. So they're getting kind of this, this sort of intangible like pat on the head, and you get to be part of our group. You're not really part of the elite and you're not really making any money off of it. You're not the profiteers, but we'll give you a piece so that you can kind of help us with this persuasion. And it's those hangers on that are kind of the bottom, the largest part of the pyramid that really do entrench this. And we saw this very much, during COVID. I draw
Yes.
this line between cancel culture to social credit to kind of state social credit. And we're very much in that kind of middle phase where you have a bunch of people who are now coming after people, coming after their social standing, so it limits their opportunities, coming after their job, their actual source of income that leads them to invest in wealth. And in some cases, the actual businesses themselves. Businesses were shut down during COVID. People tried to cancel other businesses. To our neighbors to the north, we saw their bank accounts frozen during the Freedom Convoy, the Trucker Freedom Convoy. So all of these things that are these physical manifestations of coming after you and your wealth creation opportunities for wrongthink. And it really is that last mile, that push, that acceptance, because we've got the technology to collect this data, but you got to have the buy-in.
Yeah.
And now you've got the buy-in because people can feel like they're part of that right think team.
So one other thing that they often do is they will couch things in terms that are not only seem positive, but just downright uncontroversial. So your point about like having this culture where you're renting everything on surface, it's maybe let me play devil's advocate. Is this kind of that Fight Club mentality that if you have too much material stuff and you're too much bogged down by your possessions, that is counterproductive to a thriving life? And if you do have this kind of digital nomad versatility where at the drop of a hat, like I can spend a week living in Tahiti, then I can spend a week living in London. I don't have all these possessions bogging me down. That is a better approach than so-called consumer capitalism. I mean, that's what it sounds like they're tapping into, but what do they really mean?
Yeah, so I think that is the sales point. Wouldn't it
Right.
nice to just be YOLO and you can be free, and you're truly free? But really, if people who've not owned things throughout history have been very unfree, they've not been happy, and most of the time they've ended up dead. So I don't think that usually works out for them. I think that it is this, it's two layers for me, Michael. And you can tell me, where you think that maybe I'm missing the point here, but because this is a little bit of my own editorializing. Part of it is they need you to think that in order for it to work. And so if they say, oh well, it's more convenient for you to own a home, and they you get the media buying it, well, it may not be such a great investment. You can rent versus buy, and look how expensive it is. Again, taking away this largest asset and the largest driver of wealth for households on a legacy basis. You've got that piece. And then on the buy-in of it, there's part of this fantasy of, yes, I want to live this. But I think the other piece is people putting up sort of a protection barrier, like a psychological protection barrier, because it has become so difficult, because now you have corporations coming into the market in 2010 for the first time ever and competing with you to buy a home. Now they're buying one in every five. Now mortgage rates are up. People are getting these ridiculous educations from the predatory national lending scheme that's sending wealth from young people to colleges and their administrators. So like, even if they get a good job, then they have to pay down all this debt. They can't even think about buying a house, and then they'll look at the price of the house. So I think it's a protection mechanism. Like, if you don't think this is attainable for you, why not buy into the narrative? It's like, oh, it's not that that it's too expensive for me. I just want to live this Instagram life and be able to
Yeah. Yeah.
go around and show everybody how great my life is, instead of actually having something that I've worked for and I can show the fruits of my labor and has that opportunity to create that wealth for me.
And interesting you said fruits of my labor, because that's exactly like Aesop's fable of the sour grapes, how the fox is trying to get the grapes. He's jumping
Yeah.
up and down. He gets a lad, he can't reach him. He goes, ah, they were sour anyway. So it's kind of like, oh, I can't afford a home. I'm saddled in debt. Oh, I never wanted a home. That's what boomers
Right.
have. And I don't want to be a boomer. So,
Right.
that's how they did it back in the 1950s. Home ownership is passe. But, and something else just clicks. Like, you have to read between the lines with this propaganda when they say you will own nothing and you'll be happy. Well, someone's going to be owning it. So if I'm not owning it, you know what I mean? It's like you and I aren't owning it, but that means someone else is owning it. And if
That
someone is owning where I'm staying, they're in a position to charge, historically, this is what the ultra lefties were really railing against, is landlordism, right? This idea that I'm working at a factory 14 hours and my landlord has complete control over my life. I have no leverage with him. I have no sanitation. The rents are through the roof, no ventilation. What am I going to do about it? That kind of have very heavily changed, as especially in England under Thatcherism, when you have the kind of
Yeah.
this democratization of homeownership. But then it's like, yeah, if you, the person watching this video, doesn't own it, well, Klaus Schwab and his buddies are. And if you
Bernie
own all the
Sanders has
property,
3 homes.
yeah, and if you own those properties, you're really sitting pretty, and it's a lot easier to spend that week in Bali when I do have those 3 homes and I Airbnb them.
Yeah, and it's interesting. One of the things I've done in the book is I went to these companies that are buying up homes, and as of the end of 2022, it was like 1 out of every 5 homes was being
That's
sold to a corporate
crazy.
buy. It's insane. Again, this didn't exist before 2010, so this is a huge, huge escalation. And I go to their
Wait, can I
financial
interrupt?
filings.
Because I think this is such a key point that I really want to kind of spend a
Yes,
minute on it.
please.
It's really kind of one of the things that's, the tragedy of the commons is this idea that if you have land that no one owns, like everyone just takes a dump on it because no one really regards as their own, and you don't have upkeep and maintenance, right? Like this is like why roads
Correct.
tend to be crappy. Whereas if it's my house, as opposed like every landlord,
My
let's look at the other
kingdom.
perspective. If I'm
Yeah.
renting it out, they're going to trash it. They don't fucking care. Whereas if it's my house, I have a huge incentive to kind of keep a nice home if I want to resell it and so on and so forth. So to have it with these corporations where they're owning it instead of the people living in that house owning it, that is going to have a huge skewed effect on so many other things.
It is. It's like this, domino effect one
Yeah,
after another. So one thing that I did is I went to the financial statements of these publicly traded companies, whether it be a 10K or an annual report. And I just took their language and I just reprinted it in the book because like I couldn't editorialize better than they've said it themselves. And they talk about it being a golden opportunity and how they're going after the middle class because those are the people who can pay for it, and you're just reading it and you're going, what the heck is going on here? And then you look there. 60 Minutes did a piece on this with Leslie Stahl, and she talked to the head of Tricon Residential, which actually happens to be based in Canada. So it's a Canadian based publicly traded company here in the US that is buying up tens of thousands of homes. And he was basically like, yeah, we're going to, we want to rent the American dream. And that is just so crazy because like as you said, so that's a wealth transfer from Main Street and the middle and working class to Wall Street, some who may not even be here in this country, as we continue to see over and over again. And that's just really staggering fact that that's something that's going on, like just another hurdle on top of all of the regulation that adds to the price, on top of all the local politics that basically prohibits more building and whatnot, that you have these people going, we're going to rent you the American dream. And back to your point, that phrase, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy, is charged with so much. Like you said, they say you, it's not will own nothing, it's not
right.
I'll own nothing, it's specifically you. And I thought that was very telling because as we talk about, kind of go through their different projections, the way that they're framed really tells you a lot, as well as that, be happy piece and that buy-in. So, it's a short phrase, but it's so powerful and sort of uncovering the psychology behind what it is that they're thinking and what they're trying to project onto you.
Let's I want to get into that in a second, but let's talk about these companies buying up all these houses, because I don't think people appreciate, in my opinion, to what extent the malevolence of the Republican Party is in this regard. Because if you have this industry and they're investing all this money in real estate, there's something which you're extremely familiar with called moral hazard, right? Which
Yes.
is if I'm investing money and I personally, like at a racetrack, if my boss gives me $100 and I have nothing to lose, there's going to be a big asymmetry. I'm going to be being riskier. What do I care? I don't have skin in the game. So if you have this huge sense of investment from corporate America into real estate, and they've been taught this lesson in the bailouts, both during COVID and at the end of the Bush presidency. If it all goes to hell, and at a certain point it has to, because you can only buy so many resources before the price bottoms out and the market corrects itself. Well, I don't really care because I just got to call up Mitch McConnell, and the Republican Party will be tripping over themselves to make sure that I don't go out of business. So as opposed to if me or you, Carol, if we buy a home and the market goes out, well, too bad, we're SOL. If the house is underwater, that's our problem. And we saw this enormously during COVID, where many businesses, which were unique and special in New York, Ice and Vice is the best ice cream company I've ever been to. They couldn't survive it. They don't have that phone number to the White House. Whereas if I'm Haagen Dazs or Target, they're Nancy Pelosi can't wait to make sure that I'm taken care of. So there's this huge asymmetry.
She has that
Oh
freezer
yes,
full of
that's right.
ice cream,
That
right?
was, yeah,
Yeah.
the
So
perfect
so that
example.
that's very important for her. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really a perfect example here. So, this was such an Occupy Wall Street talking point about how
Yeah.
Main Street's bailing out Wall Street, but it's true. And we're about to see it happen again. I mean, you have history in investment banking. Uh, this is not. Am I wrong that this is not sustainable? Like at a certain point, you can only buy so many empty homes and not get that ROI.
So I talk about in the book, I call it the vulturing of boom and bust cycles.
Yeah,
So basically the idea that the Federal Reserve, tries to play God in the market, and they have, especially over the last 15 years, have come in and interfered on these crazy levels with this suppression of interest rates, 9 years of near zero interest rate policy, printing $9 trillion. What people don't understand and appreciate, and frankly, there's a lot of it because it's opaque intentionally. But these booms and busts are fantastic for Wall Street because it washes out the people. You use the Great Recession, financial crisis. Think about what happened there. As they said, everybody go get a house. We want you all to go get houses, and there was a frenzy, and everyone got a house, and everyone was at fault, right? Everybody was being greedy. I mean, obviously the derivatives people were being greedy, the investment banks were being greedy, Wall Street is being greedy, people were being greedy, whatnot. But like you said, the Wall Street ended up with a bailout, and you had almost 5 million homes that were lost to foreclosure or short sales. So the average person didn't get a bailout. Then they said, well, to help things along, we're going to create cheap capital. But that's not, again, going to like you or me, that's going to Wall Street. So now you have, this market that's been decimated, and this money that goes to Wall Street. And they're like, oh, it's a bonanza. We could come in and buy these things at low prices. And so that's the issue, is that when you have these big booms and busts, and they've gotten bigger and boomier and bustier as the Fed has done more intervention, the people on Wall Street have that ability for duration. They love it. They have enough
yeah.
capital, they can sustain themselves through the bad period, and then during the good period, then they're pigs. They just, they feast on everything that is left, or vultures. And so for the average person, you don't have that ability. It's actually one of the reasons why I think a house, I talk about this in the book, why a house is actually the biggest asset on personal balance sheets, because of duration. When you go to own a house, you consume it, right? If you have kids, you put your kids in a school. Unless there's a really specific reason, you don't want to disrupt that. So you're not on like Zillow every day being like, oh, well, my house is down, I better get out of it
Yeah,
now,
yeah.
like you would be with a stock. And it takes that sort of like the booms and the busts, it smooths them out, and you have this duration, and duration is usually what sort of leads to the wealth creation. You compound that value over time, and you take out those ins and outs. You kind of leave them alone so that you can get from point A to point B. And so, the idea that these booms and busts are bad for someone, they're really bad for the average person who panics and inevitably will sell out at the bottom, either because they're scared or because they need capital because something else has happened, they need to live. And Wall Street, with all the money and then getting extra access to it through the Federal Reserve, just feasts on it. So this is something that is, if it's not intentional, it's deliberate.
Can you talk a bit about ESG? Because ESG is this term that is another boogeyman term on the right.
Right.
And they also, so it's very easy to portray it as QAnon, which is kind of this term du jour for something I don't like. Um, and so I want to come into this skeptical that maybe this is just all propaganda and it's all
Yeah.
innocuous. What is ESG in reality, and how is it used to kind of leverage and control?
So I'd like to actually tell you what ESG is in reality, but nobody really knows because they
Okay.
changed the definition of it
Okay.
intentionally. It stands for environmental, social, and governance factors. And again, good idea to bad outcome. Like, we all want to be good stewards of the environment. It's great to have a good governance of your business. If you have good diversity and you're nice to your employees, usually that bodes well for your business. Like, all these things the market kind of takes care of,
Yeah.
if allowed to operate. The thing about ESG, I call it business social credit, because really what
Yes.
it is at its core is a bunch of people, these elite, who are sitting around a table being like, how can we control outcomes by holding businesses hostage, using, we don't even have to use our own capital. We'll use everybody else's capital that's in their retirement funds and in the market. And because we control it, that we will basically bully these companies into doing what we want them to do. And we will actually take away the fiduciary duty of boards of directors to make sure the company is doing what's best for the shareholders, because now we've given them this higher moral criteria. And as the question is always to ask, like, according to whom? who are the people who are setting this? Is it the WEF? Is it BlackRock? And is it some accounting firm? Like, who's deciding when these people don't have stakes, or they're investing other people's money and using that to kind of push agendas? And that's part of what's moved us away from fossil fuels in such a huge way, because they said fossil fuels are anti-ESG, at least in some levels. Although if you look at the S&P 500 index, they kicked Tesla out of that index, the green company, and they left in Exxon because they didn't like that Musk was going after free speech on Twitter. So it's one of those, it's very fungible, and that's on purpose, because they want to be able to say, oh, okay, this isn't working for us now, we need to shift it. Just kind of like global warming became climate change. They went, that's a problem. We were very specific about that. Climate's much more general, so that can cover ups, downs, ice ages, rainbows, whatever it is that we don't like, where warming is like really specific. And so that's what we're seeing with ESG, that weapons are bad. Oh, we're invading Ukraine. Weapons are good. Jets are bad. Oh, except for, private jets of the people that we like, and Amazon delivering packages. Like, kind of like COVID, there's no like data or science here. It's all about picking winners and losers. And they're really using that as a way to, kind of reshape how businesses behave, because normally businesses aren't as susceptible to this. Where we started this discussion is that most of the people who are carrying this out have no idea what ESG means. Many of the heads of ESG, I mean, I've talked to people who are even ESG heads of publicly traded companies, haven't even heard of the World Economic Forum. They don't know that this actually came out of the UN, and kind of the whole trajectory and how it sort of seeped in. And I heard about a CEO recently who was like real competitive, and he wanted to get his ESG score up. And so he's trying to do these things. And every time they did things like this, oh, well, we have to do this. Okay, well, we did that. Oh, but now we did this thing. And because we did this thing, now it's down again. So it didn't move. And it's like this gamification of like, oh, I want the good credit. Or in some cases for CEOs, it's just managing risk. They don't want to be the reason why they're not getting the access to capital, or, getting some sort of, issue going on in social media. So it's like, okay, like, what do I have to pay to just like make this thing go away and look like I'm being compliant? And that's how it becomes this like sort of entrenched blob. Now, we have seen a lot of pushback on it, which has caused like one of the main groups that helped entrench it here in the US, BlackRock, which is the largest asset manager in the world. And they were very focused on it. And they were, really the pushers. They're big mad that we figured this out. So now it's like, ESG has become politicized, so I'm not going to use the name ESG anymore. And it's like, I don't think the name was what the problem was, dude. It was the behaviors that are the problem. So, they're going to change it. It won't be ESG at some point. It'll be impact investing or sustainable impact or some other, garbled alphabet soup. And, just like everything else, they'll just keep trying and doing everything they can, because it gives them more power, it gives them more fees, it gives them more wealth, and particularly insidious because it uses your capital to be able to do that.
Hey folks, billionaire investor Ray Dalio said increasing the debt limit means there's no meaningful limit on the debt and will eventually lead to a disastrous financial collapse. Bloomberg warning of a severe economic reset. Gold appears as a caged bull awaiting a catalyst. JP Morgan warned cut stocks, buy gold, and hold your cash. And the Financial Times said investors are gaga for gold. Wells Fargo said gold is in a super cycle that could last another 6 years. Worst case scenario, $3,000 gold. So searches for how to buy gold on Google hit record levels in April. It's as simple as calling the Patriot Gold Group today to get yours. Find out why they are A+ rated, Consumer Affairs top rated gold and silver company nationwide. Call the proud Americans of Patriot Gold Group today before it's too late and mention my name. That's Michael Malice, and you'll always get best in class service from Patriots protecting Patriots. Patriot Gold Group has the no fee for life IRA, where your IRA or 401k can be in physical gold and silver, and you may be eligible for the no fee for life IRA on qualifying rollovers. All you have to do is call 888-505-9845 to get a free investor guide, or simply just go to malicegold.com. Patriot Gold Group is Consumer Affairs top-rated gold IRA dealer 6 years in a row. So call 888-505-9845 or go to malicegold.com to protect your money.
Have you ever heard that story that Napoleon used the Egyptian Sphinx for target practice and shot its nose off? Or maybe you've heard that a French astrologer named Nostradamus correctly predicted nearly 500 years of human history. Or maybe someone told you that the legendary blues guitarist Robert Johnson sold his soul to the devil at a crossroads in Mississippi. These stories are what I like to call historical myths. Great little tales that may or may not have any basis in historical fact. On Our Fake History, we explore these historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story it simply must be told. If you dig stories about death-obsessed emperors, lost civilizations, desperate sieges, voodoo black magic, and famous historical figures you thought you knew, then Our Fake History might just be your new favorite podcast. If you dig it, then subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts.
It's so interesting hearing you talk about this, because when I was doing my research for Dear Reader, the book on North Korea, and obviously and the White Pill as well, about the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe more broadly, this behind the Iron Curtain, so many of these techniques that were used and perfected by these totalitarian countries are, I had this tweet about how corporate America is so much more successful. Capitalism is so great. You could see that corporate America is so much more successful pushing Maoism than the CCP ever was. Because
Perfect.
it's true though, because if you had Xi Jinping sitting me or you or anyone down and being like, you guys should have struggle sessions, he'd be laughed. Even here in lefty circles, be like, okay, crazy person. But then you do have these, I think it was Northwestern University Legal, where everyone on the phone call got up and say, my name's Carol and I'm a racist. My name's Michael and I'm a racist,
Right.
which is straight up Maoist struggle session, where you have to get up in front of your peers and denounce yourself and your wrongdoing. And this was the kind of the basis of social control there. And it also speaks to a couple of just points when the UN went after North Korea for having concentration camps. Their answer, which is brilliant in a way, is we don't use that term, so we don't have any. And it's just like so yeah, well, we don't believe in ESG anymore. That's so it's like we don't believe in puppies. We're for baby dogs. It's
right.
Great,
like every
great.
bill that's ever named. This is the fluffy puppy bill. It actually kills cats, but it's the fluffy puppy bill, so it must be good. Why are you against fluffy puppies, Michael? I don't understand. Do you hate them? Why don't you want to sign the fluffy puppy bill?
So there is this sort of kind of shamelessness to what they're doing. But what else kind of disturbed me is North Korea has something called Sungbun, which I'm sure you're probably not familiar with, which is, I believe in the 1950s was the first iteration of this. They interviewed every single person in the country. And one of the iterations is called the Understanding People Project. And you have to understand that when the government says, oh, we just want to understand people, you better run for the hills. And what they did as a consequence of this is they figured out what everyone was doing before the Korean War or the Fatherland Liberation War, when the great leader Kim Il Sung single-handedly eliminated the wicked Jap devils from Korea and reestablished Korean independence. And you were slotted into the preferred or wavering or hostile class, and I think there's 31 subclasses based on your family. So if your grandparent was a priest, you're hostile. If your grandfather fought with the great leader Kim Il Sung, you're at the top. But this also determines who you marry, where you go to school, where you can live. whether you can join the army, literally everything about your life. So when I first heard this coming down the pike, I'm like, wait a minute, this sounds eerily familiar. And I thought, okay, maybe this is just I've been drinking the Kool-Aid too much about North Korea. Not everything is North Korea. But then hearing it broken down, it's not literally a function of your grandparents, but it's like your access to credit is determined explicitly whether you comply with this hardcore lefty propaganda.
Yeah, and this is the through line. This is how all these things get connected. So they have it at the business level, and then they have it at the personal level. So business social credit and personal social credit, which is very much like the social credit system that's formalized in China. And
Yeah.
what was fascinating when I did the research about China, because there's a lot of misinformation about their social credit system, which is bad, but it's just different than the way that it's portrayed, is that it's actually much more developed for businesses than it is for people. It's still very developed for people, but they went after the businesses first.
Right.
And you might go, well, why would China go after the businesses first? It's because they tried to import like some level of capitalism. And what happened was that a bunch of those companies got very powerful. When China tried to roll out their central bank digital currency, they got a bunch of people to open wallets, but it's like something like 40 or 50 cents equivalent is in everybody's wallet because no one wants to use it because they're already using these private payment companies, things like 10 cents pay and the Alibaba and company has their own payment system. So those are the ones. So Jack Ma, who founded Alibaba and Ant Group, made lots of money. And I don't know if you've noticed in the news how he's been disappeared a lot.
Yeah.
He's kind of come back again, but they took away or he gave up some of his ownership. Sorry, it wasn't that they took it away. He gave it up. I'm sure totally voluntarily.
Because
Some
he
of
wanted
his
to be
ownership.
happy. He
Right,
wanted
he
to own
wants to
nothing
be.
and
He
be
didn't want to
happy.
own anything. Right, he was just doing this, to serve man. So he just basically gave it up, and so there's been a lot of pushback at the business level because if you can say, hey, if you get too big for your britches, this is what we're going to do to you, and we can even do it to a business. It's much easier than to come down and conduct it at the individual level, which is equally as horrible, but it is sort of this sort of two-tier system there.
And it also kind of speaks to if you watch how NPCs on social media repeat corporate talking points shamelessly. And I always tell people if you argue with them, you might as well be arguing with your TV. Quite literally, they're mindless. And one of the
Right.
things I've seen the last recent months, which I'm sure you have as well, is this insistence that there were never vaccine mandates. That you were never forced to take a vaccine, and it's like so much of the corporate press, it's factual but not truthful. In
Right.
that, yeah, it wasn't that the government said you had to have it, but if your job, corporate America and even medium and small business did a great job of being like, all right, you don't have to get a vaccine. You just can't work here anymore or step in the door.
You can't participate in society. And I make this point in the book that obviously these mandates were found to be unconstitutional, and a lot of it has shifted, or it was so late in the game it didn't matter anymore. But if you were a business, and there was this executive order from Biden that basically said if you're over a certain size, you have to make sure everybody's vaccinated. Even if that shifts or changes, you don't really want to run afoul of the government or pay, like maybe access to capital or other things. So if it is in this gray area, even though technically you may not have to do it anymore, you may feel compelled to comply. Just like when the guy from North Korea is coming and having an interview with you, like he may say you can speak freely, but that there's a repercussion for that. And I think that a lot of the repercussions were either real and sort of explained as, oh well, you didn't have to do it, you just couldn't be part of society, or there was this sort of looming fear that if you did something that you would be punished for it.
Can you speak, given your expertise, in investment banking, like is the housing market going in a very bad direction in the medium to short term?
So I think it's very different this time around, and it has to do with some of the disruptions in supply and demand in the market. Because of the overbuilding before the Great Recession financial crisis, and then the fact that they forced people to give up their homes, through foreclosures and short sale, there was so much inventory in that next decade that they ended up underbuilding. So the estimates are anywhere from 4 to 5+ million housing units that are underbuilt right now. So we don't really have enough supply.
Okay.
And we also have other issues, things like COVID shut down, the labor market in a way that even, where people want to build, they can't find the laborers to build. So there are all these reasons where we don't have enough supply. Where I think you will probably see a crack in certain geographic markets is you will see all the people who invested in Airbnbs
Yeah.
and decided that this was going to be their big thing and took those out. I think that a lot of that may come to fruition in certain markets. So you may have some certain markets where you get those Airbnbs, some portion of them back on the market. But again, then you've got, these corporations with all this capital on the sideline, like waiting to swoop them up. So, you may have a little bit of a crack, a temporary thing, but I think overall, I don't think that it's residential housing. Corporate real estate, particularly like the commercial office space, is a disaster because you have all of these loans that are coming due in the next, some of them this year, some of them, particularly in the office space, over the next 2 years. You have these crazy prices. You have everybody who's still working from home.
Right.
So the office buildings are, full. And you've got these banks that are having all of these issues in terms of what they can lend to. So I think there is going to be a crack in the commercial real estate market. But again, it's commercial lenders, it's the institutional capital that will be reshuffled and reallocated. It will definitely have some level of impact, but I don't think that will be the 2008, kind of impact. Where we really are screwed up with the banks is just, the fact that when the Fed gave them all of this money, this free money, put it out there, you had all these people who are like, oh, I'm going to come, I'm going to come to the bank, and the bank doesn't have enough, need to lend out, and they didn't have anything to do with all these deposits. So they started sticking them into things like long-term treasuries, somehow not thinking that the Fed was ever going to raise rates, which is just like literally insane if you're in the financial services industry. And so when all of these people decided that they were going to pull money out because the Fed's now raised interest rates and you can get 5% like on a T-bill or something like that, or they needed it for their lives, then these banks were like, oh, we don't have enough capital, and if we sell these treasuries we have on our balance sheet, we're going to take a loss, and now we're going to be insolvent. So we've already seen a little bit of that. A few of these banks that have imploded, in March. I don't know that all of the insanity in banking is over. If you go back to the Great Recession financial crisis, that took multiple years to really unfold. I think in retrospect, it seemed like it was really fast, but we had the first
Yeah.
spate of bankruptcies, and then it was quite a long time before you saw Bear Stearns, and even between Bear Stearns and Lehman was something like 6 or 8 months. So I don't know that we're out of the woodwork there either, but the Fed's doing whatever they can to try to support it. So maybe they'll find a way to patch it, patch it all through. But at some point, you've got all these patches on everything, and you can't patch it anymore. And that goes back to our initial thesis about the shifts in the global financial order. The reality is, we have a situation where our U.S. government debt to GDP on a public basis is at 125%. The IMF and other entities have said like 70 to 80% is like kind of the max before it becomes unstable. The Treasury and the CBO have said we're on an unsustainable fiscal path. We've been weaponizing the dollar. It's not stable in the international realm. Like, there are lots of cracks in the system. The challenge that we don't know, and I wish I could tell you, but if I could tell you this, then I would be on a yacht in the Mediterranean and not chatting with you, Michael, is exactly when it's going to happen. Because it could unravel in 12 months. It could be 12 years. It could be 50 years. It's just duration, the amount of patches they try to put in to prolong this, it takes time before it all unravels. And plus, there are these geopolitical issues that could make it happen more quickly or could push it out. So lots of things, but we see the trajectory. The trajectory itself is not debatable.
You're Welcome with Michael Malice is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Folks, most of you listening right now are probably multitasking. Yep, you're listening to me talk, but you're also driving, cleaning, exercising, maybe even grocery shopping. But if you're not in some kind of moving vehicle, there's something else you could be doing right now, which is getting an auto quote from Progressive Insurance. It's easy and you can save money by doing it right from your phone. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save nearly $700 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Discounts for having multiple vehicles on your policy, being a homeowner, and more. So just like your favorite podcast, Progressive will be with you 24/7, 365 days a year, so you're protected no matter what. Multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at Progressive.com to join the over 29 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $698 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations. Let's get back to the show. So let me get a little bit personal. Are you still living in Chicago? And just how bad is it, and has it gotten since you and I last spoke?
So I split my time right now. So I decided to double down on really bad states. So I'm part of the time I'm in Illinois and part of the time I'm in California. But to be fair, I am in Newport Beach, which is a red enclave of California. So I
Okay.
traded. So every one of my
But you're doing it
neighbors.
you're doing it in reverse. You want the blue enclave in the red state.
I know. I know. We don't have kids, so we don't care about our legacy. We're just
Okay.
trying to get a nice sunset. But at any rate, so every one of my neighbors has the American flag out. So from part of this is like having local community stuff that's really good. And we have a really good, strong local community where I know locally I'm protected, because it's harder to protect as you kind of go up. You kind of have to
Sure.
start at the community level. So yes, we want to try to eventually get in all of those things aligned, but at least we have gone from being in a really bad blue community some of the time to a red community some of the time. But in Chicago, it's real heartbreaking because I'm from Chicago. I'm a native to the suburbs. I've gone downtown my whole life. I live downtown. It's a fabulous city that has just been torn apart, and it's just heartbreaking, to see the level of violence, the amount of businesses that have been decimated, the vibrancy of the city. We go for walks out here in our neighborhood, multiple times a week. And my husband says, like, you won't do this in Chicago, because it used to be like I would walk literally everywhere. And then
Yeah.
over the last couple of years, like, you think that we've had somebody outside of our building get stabbed at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So like
Was it you?
what's that?
Did
It
you
was
were you the one
I
with the
was
knife,
not the I was
Carol?
not the,
Because you've got a sharp tongue.
I do. I'm really not great with a knife. Like, you should see me cut bread. Much better with other weapons. So that one was not me. I had my alibi of not being there then. But it's really sad and shameful, because it's a great city, and I hate seeing what's happening to that city and other cities. Like, I'm sure it's similar to your feelings about your former great city that you lived in and all the
But
wonderful places that you visited.
but it kind of, I was just having this conversation last night. I had a Peter McCormick, who runs the podcast called What Bitcoin Did. He made a bet with me. He lost the bet. So he had to buy me a nice fancy dinner, and he had a +1. So I decided to bring my buddy, Michael Wolf, who's a strength coach. He's like 290. I'm like, all right,
Nice.
you want to lose a bet? You're going to be paying for a
Yeah,
lot of
yeah.
food at this
Yeah,
sushi, at
yeah,
Ichi,
yeah.
the sushi place. And Michael's from Chicago. And the point I made with him is, when we were kids, there was the famous Second City comedy troupe, right?
I
Chicago.
trained with them.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
Chicago was a rival to New York. And if
Yes.
you tell kids this nowadays, that Chicago and New York used to be like competitive, they'll laugh in your face, because it's
Right.
just like insane, right? So New York will always have that, I think, well, I don't want to say always, has that cachet. I
Sure.
think the Chicago of when you and I are kids, in terms of it being like New York
Right.
rival, it's
New York
long
Light.
gone.
Yeah. I
And I
agree
don't
with
see a
that.
mechanism for turning it around.
Yeah, I mean, the mechanisms to turn that or anything around would require people to address uncomfortable things
Yes.
that they don't want to address, which is sad. And by the way, it ties back to the theme of the book, well, You Will Own Nothing. These poverty issues, go back to, cultural and government issues where you're not teaching people to retain wealth. Like, how do you build wealth? No, they want you dependent upon the government so that you can get a vote. They're not trying to make you independent and giving you those tools to succeed. So it really, they have proven that they can hold on to that power with the "you will own nothing" thesis. They're just trying to move the number of people that they have under that. And for the younger generations in particular, it's becoming a reality. But hey, Michael, they'll be happy.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things in your subtitle, and I just got two questions about it, says, and how to fight back. It drove me crazy and still does when publishers insist that the last chapter of a book be the author's personal recommendations, because someone can be the world's most amazing diagnostician, but if their
Yes.
recommendations are don't cut ice with the audience, right away, retroactively, the whole book gets put into question. So I could be the best. If I can spot cancer from a mile away, and I'm like, my answer is terrible. It's like, wait a minute, maybe you're not that good as a diagnostician. No, these are separate things.
Right, right.
So was this something that they made you do in terms of having your own recommendations? And also, so I'll ask that first.
Yeah, so no. Well, here's the thing about me. Nobody makes me do much of
Okay, that's
anything.
fair.
So I'm one of those where it's like, "Oh, you want me to not do that? I'm gonna do that twice." You know what
That's
I
true.
mean? So
That's true.
that's
Okay.
yeah, that's kind of I'm a tough sell for that. So what's the second part of the question?
What is your
What
recommendation? Yeah,
No, yeah,
like,
so this actually was important to me because I totally understand and agree that sometimes, you're the person who has this talent and people are like, well, why don't you know this? It's like, because that's just not what I do. But in
yeah,
this particular case, it was what I do. And I will tell you that the advice in many ways that I give is not any different than the advice I would probably give you anyway, and just good, sound financial advice. But we've gotten so far away from that, and it sort of resonates differently in this particular context, that I think it puts a different spin on it for people. So, it's very it's about altering your behaviors and altering your financial behaviors, and obviously, depending on somebody, in their own financial situation, it's going to be different. And so I also can't give quote unquote financial advice, because then you run into trouble with the SEC. God forbid you try to help people out. They can blow $10,000 on a gold toilet, but God forbid you try to help them with an investment. But just pretty basic things to think through vis-a-vis each of these issues individually. So one thing that we didn't get to talk about yet is this idea that there's all this wealth that's set to turn over voluntarily in the next 23 years. $84.4 trillion is the estimate. And the bulk of that is not billionaire money, it's sort of every person's money. And my fear, given the level of debt we have and given the almost $130 trillion in unfunded liabilities, is that that money looks really amazing, right? Like, if you're the government, it's like, how do I get my hands voluntarily? We talked about this. Like, it's so much easier to plunder
yes.
legally than it is to go out and like invade somebody and take their money by force. So what could they possibly do? So I don't know if you've noticed in the news how there's been this sort of pop up of, oh, we want to have like a wealth tax, or we want to have a tax on unrealized capital gains, or we want better inheritance taxes because the super rich shouldn't be able to hold on to all of that money and to pass it down, and we should have it. And what that says to me, knowing what I know, is that the people on the inside are always going to have the lawyers and the accountants and the loopholes. And oh, by the way, they're probably helping try to write the legislation. So they are going to be protected and grandfathered in. But once you concede that principle, that property rights aren't important, then they're going to come after your wealth. So I think that this big pool is super at risk. So I brought in a great estate planning attorney who talked about things like going through and doing trusts and talking to an estate planner and seeing how you can protect your money, through these structures, the same kinds of structures that the elite use. Because I'm very much into like follow what the elite
Yeah.
do instead of what they say. I think that's
Yes.
important because they're,
Revealed preferences.
climate change, they're all flying private jets and, buying waterfront mansions. So using those things, because if they are grandfathered, then you, as one of the people who thought to do this, that we can't guarantee that, but it might be a prudent step. If you have more capital, or maybe you can go in with some people, another thing that the elite are doing is they're buying land, particularly productive land, things that have water rights, timber, farming, ranches. I don't know, have lots of people in the book who I mentioned, from Bill Gates to, Warren Buffett and the like, will all go, oh, land's like a great thing. So you might want to pay attention to that. For something like a CBDC, a central bank digital currency coming out, if you're worried about like how are you going to trade or barter if they like shut down access to your
Yeah.
money, that may make sense. I'm more of a hard asset person. So things like gold and silver in smaller quantities. I know there are a lot of crypto people probably in your audience. I'm sort of neutral to it. Do your research, but that may or may not be a potential solution. So it's about having the plan. I liken it to your house burning down. Like, you don't want to have the escape plan and try to buy insurance. Like when you see the fire springing, you want to be thinking about these things. And at the end of the day, if you never have to use them, God bless, that's going to work out well.
Yep.
But most of this is really good financial advice. Having diversification, different assets, thinking through things. Like, nobody at the end of the day is like, wow, I really wish I wasn't so well diversified and hadn't like planned for this. That really sucked. Like, that's just not one of
This
those
is
outcomes.
this might literally be the first time where someone is actually giving useful, concrete tips. I'm not even joking, because you always read it and it's like the world's going to hell, your kids are going to be transitioned, education's ruined. What's your answer? Well, make sure to vote Republican in your local election. You're like, okay, like this, like where, like I get, where do you go with this? So that actually,
Here's the thing
go
I
ahead.
want to say about this is that this is super overwhelming stuff, right? Like, you're reading this
Yeah,
book and you're going, oh, no, let me just be clear. Like, you're not going to be able to change a new financial world order from happening. Like, none of us are, right? Like, it's just, you're not. We may be able to delay it, by the way. We might. But the most important thing you can do is just make sure, particularly, usually in these transitions, there's a period of chaos and then something happens, is that like you've thought through, like, what am I going to do in that period of chaos, and put yourself in the best position so you're not like in shock going, what the heck, my entire world just happens, like I can't get my medicines anymore, like what is happening. It's important to come to terms with this now. And again, like, let's just hope that the duration is long and it's not us, it's somebody else that has to deal with it. But that's the reality of the situation. But I do hope that the advice is practical, and as I said, it's going to shift based on your own financial situation, but it's the kind of financial advice that's just good in practice as well.
it's interesting what you just said, because part of my Soviet upbringing was whenever I would talk to someone, and I trained my way out of this to a large extent, I would basically run a scan before I tell them anything, because I'd ask myself, okay, if this person turns on you, is this information that they can use against you? And that
Yes.
was very useful, because people don't turn on you in terms of becoming a villain, but people are unreliable, or they're
Yes.
lazy, or
Right.
they want to say to your face, "Oh, I'd love to work with you," and then they're not taking your call. So if
Right.
you're planning for these people to fall through in some context or another, it's a lot easier where you're not missing a beat. When they don't pick up your phone, great, I have a plan B, C, D, and E. So that's really useful advice. Is like, okay, plan for the worst so that when
Hope
it
for the
comes,
best. Right. Yeah.
yeah, you're also not panicking. You're like, okay, this sucks that I'm in this situation, but I know I've got my freak out bag. I know exactly what to do. It's
Right.
go time, and now I feel confident that I am ready to handle this less than desirable situation.
And can I tie this back to this whole concept that we started with of taking a conspiracy? Because I've had a few people being like, "Oh, Carol, you sound like a prepper," and I think there is a important nuance between being a prepper and being prepared. I think the
Yeah,
people who are preppers, which by the way, there's totally nothing wrong with it, and understand what's driving them, but they live with that like every moment of the day. That's the way they walk through their life, is that everything is through the lens of, things are going wrong and I'm going to do that. I feel like being prepared is sort of almost the opposite, is that you do the preparation so you can walk through life without that burden.
yeah,
And then if
yeah.
you have to address it, you do it. But I mean, like, I'm a really happy person. Like, I enjoy things. I try to, it's not like I'm walking around going, oh my God, de-dollarization every single day, other than when I'm on podcasts. But you do it so that you don't hold that burden and that you can enjoy your life, because at the end of the day, we don't even know how much time that we have here. So we want to make sure that we're enjoying our days, but also having that level of preparation.
Carol, we're running out of time. What has been your favorite part of this interview?
I liked when you shouted out, It's a cookbook.
You are welcome.